Hello everyone. Let's subscribe to Relationship Stories before we forget. You won't want to miss what's coming up next.
I am a Chinese language teacher at a middle school in a rural town in China, born in the 1990s. My father, Ding Zhuang, was also a teacher at a middle school, while my mother, Chen Li, worked at home, farming and tending to the household. Though she lived a simple life in the countryside, my mother was incredibly beautiful. Her skin as fair as the moon, her features delicate like a celestial fairy. The men in our village couldn't help but steal glances, their eyes filled with desire, wishing they could take her as their own. Because of this, my father cherished her deeply. He spoiled her, never letting her do any hard work. Over time, this constant care turned into indulgence, and my mother became used to a life of ease, avoiding labor and responsibility. At the school, my father had a close friend, Juzi, who was 12 years younger and taught mathematics. They were like brothers, always spending time together. Juzi often came to our house, and he and my father would drink together, sharing stories late into the night. Sometimes my mother would join them. At first she was shy, but as the months went by, she became more at ease in Juzi's company. Then tragedy struck our family. One evening, my father and Juzi had been out drinking heavily. When they came home, my father collapsed into bed, completely drunk. In the middle of the night, he felt an excruciating headache, like a fever gripping his body. Panicking, he fumbled through the house, searching for medicine. In his drunken state, he took some antibiotics without thinking. The next morning, my mother went to wake him, but no matter how hard she tried, he didn't stir. His face was calm, peaceful, but his body lay still. She called his name, shaking him frantically until the terrifying realization hit her. He was dead. In shock, my mother called for an ambulance. When the doctors arrived, they confirmed that my father had passed away hours before. When asked if he had done anything unusual the night before, my mother showed them the antibiotics he had taken. The doctor's face grew grim when my mother mentioned that my father had been drinking. "That's it," the doctor said, shaking his head. "Mixing alcohol with these antibiotics is 3 times deadlier than arsenic. Drinking and taking this medication is like committing suicide." My mother was devastated, her heart shattered. Just as she was drowning in grief, Juzi rushed over to help arrange the funeral. At that time, I was a third-year university student studying to become a teacher, and I received the news of my father's death in a phone call from my mother. She told me that my father had died from a medication mix-up, poisoned in his own bed. Overcome with sorrow, I immediately took leave from school and returned home to help with the funeral. Seeing my father lying lifeless, taken from us so suddenly, left me feeling utterly helpless. My heart was broken. With my father gone, our family lost its financial pillar, and for my mother, who had grown accustomed to a life of ease, it felt as though the world had collapsed around her. With my father gone, our family had lost its breadwinner. My mother, who had become accustomed to a life of leisure, was now facing a reality she was ill-prepared for. The weight of my father's death left her shattered, and the sudden loss of financial stability felt like the sky had fallen on us. But in this dark time, Juzi stepped in. He visited frequently, offering us financial help, buying groceries, and checking in on my mother. Thanks to him, I was able to finish my university studies without having to worry about money. After I graduated, I returned home and took up a teaching position at a local primary school in our rural town. My salary, though modest, was enough to help lift us out of immediate financial distress, and for the first time since my father's death, we could begin to breathe a little easier. Juzi's kindness didn't stop there. He continued visiting us regularly, bringing food and even staying for meals. My mother, now 48 years old, was still beautiful. Her elegance only deepened with age. Juzi, who was 36, found himself captivated by her. She too was drawn to him. Perhaps it was loneliness, or perhaps it was the gratitude for his help, but over time, their relationship crossed a line. My mother, once the object of my father's deepest affections, was now emotionally entangled with Juzi. She invited him to our home more frequently, cooking special meals like dumplings and stews. And it wasn't long before their bond became more than just friendship. People say, "Flies don't land on seamless eggs." And Juzi, despite being younger, couldn't resist the allure of my mother's beauty and her advances. I, of course, was blind to what was happening. I was preoccupied with my new job, settling into adulthood, and dreaming of my own future, a future that included marriage, family, and stability. But that future was derailed by an event I could never have anticipated. One rainy Saturday night, Juzi came to our home for dinner, as he often did. My mother had invited him earlier that day, and I, as usual, sat with them, politely joining in their conversation. At some point during the meal, Juzi looked at me and said with a smile, "Xiang, I've heard you're thinking about getting married." Caught off guard, I blushed, put my head down, and took a bite of food. I nodded shyly but didn't say much. Juzi smiled knowingly, turning to my mother. "Liji, why don't you bring out 3 wine glasses? Let's toast to Xiang's bright future." He then reached into his bag and pulled out 2 bottles of red wine. The night continued with drinks and laughter, but after a few glasses of wine, I began to feel lightheaded. My cheeks were flushed, and I could feel the warmth of the alcohol taking over. "I think I'll head to bed," I said, standing up with an unsteady smile. "You two enjoy yourselves." My mother, her face also red from the wine, waved me off with a chuckle. Juzi gave me a look that made me feel uncomfortable, but I dismissed it and went to my room. Later that night, I awoke to a heavy weight pressing down on me. Disoriented, I felt something foreign inside my body, pain shooting through me. Tears filled my eyes, and in my hazy, drunken state, I blinked until I could make out the figure on top of me. It was Juzi. I was too weak to fight him off. My limbs felt heavy, and my mind was clouded. The pain slowly gave way to numbness, and soon I felt nothing but a dull sense of shame and disbelief. How could this be happening? I wanted to scream, but the alcohol had drained my strength. Suddenly, I heard my mother's voice screaming from the doorway. Her cries cut through the haze in my mind, and when she saw the scene in front of her, Juzi and I, both naked, tangled together, she was frozen in shock. When she finally moved, she rushed at Juzi, hitting him, pulling him away from me, all while shouting, "You animal! You've ruined my daughter!" Juzi, panting, stumbled back, his face flushed with guilt. My mother stood there crying, shaking with anger. I couldn't look at either of them. My body was shaking, and I felt sick, not just from the alcohol, but from the horror of what had happened. Then Juzi spoke. His voice was calm, too calm. "Liji, listen to me. I will take responsibility for this. I'll take care of Xiang. I've already divorced my wife, and I don't have any children. I have a good salary, a high position at the school. I can give you both a good life." I couldn't process what he was saying. My mother, still sobbing, looked at me with desperation in her eyes. Xiang, we have no other choice," she said softly. "He helped us when we had nothing. He's always been good to us. We can't ruin him now, not after everything." Her words cut deeper than anything Juzi had done. I felt the weight of her expectations, her fear of what the village would say, her belief that I had no future now that my purity was gone. "If you report him, we'll be the talk of the town," she continued. "They'll call you names, point fingers at us. And even if you find another man, he won't love you. Not after this. You know how men are about virginity. They'll never accept you." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there and listen, but I couldn't. I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of my mother's words and Juzi's calm, rational promises. In the end, I did nothing. I didn't report him. I didn't fight back. Instead, I let the days pass, numbly accepting what had happened. 3 months later, I found out I was pregnant. When I told my mother, she wasn't surprised. That night, she called Juzi over again, and they spoke quietly in the kitchen. I barely heard them. By the end of the evening, Juzi had convinced us that the only way to avoid shame and gossip was for him to marry me. And so, we did. We went to the Civil Affairs office, got our marriage certificate, and threw together a hasty wedding banquet. Shortly afterward, I gave birth to a daughter. My life, which I had once dreamed would be filled with hope and promise, had been rewritten in a way I could never have imagined. In this world, every family has its struggles, and mine began before I even had time to understand what was happening.
Do you think the narrator should have reported Juzi to the authorities despite the societal pressure, or was her mother's advice the only option given their situation? Let me know in the comments. That's the story I've shared with you today. If you enjoyed it, make sure to check out my playlist for more similar stories.